83-year-old black woman harassed by cops at diner, then she makes one phone call. Clara Williams sat quietly at a corner booth in the small diner on a bright Tuesday morning. The place had always been a peaceful spot in town, a warm, welcoming place where the clatter of plates and cups was often the only sound. The scent of fresh coffee filled the air, mixing with the aroma of sizzling bacon and eggs. It was the kind of place where people would stop by to catch up with friends or read the paper, just as Clara had done countless times before. At 83 years old, she had developed a routine that brought comfort. Every week, she'd visit this diner, sit in the same booth by the window, and enjoy a hot cup of coffee while reading a book or simply watching the world outside. Clara had lived through many changes in her lifetime, from the challenges of segregation to the triumphs of the civil rights movement. She had seen it all, the good and the bad, the moments of struggle and the moments of progress. But one thing that never changed was her quiet strength, her calm presence that seemed to steady those around her. Today, however, something felt different. It was subtle at first, a shift in the atmosphere, a strange tension that filled the air. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she knew something was off. The diner was busier than usual, the small tables filled with customers chatting and eating. It was a typical morning, or so it seemed. Clara had her usual, a cup of coffee and a plain bagel. She was in the middle of reading her book, lost in the pages, when she noticed movement out of the corner of her eye. A pair of uniformed police officers had entered the diner. They were talking to the waitress at the counter, but their gaze seemed to drift toward Clara. The officers stood by the door for a moment, scanning the room. Clara's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let it show. She had lived through too much in her lifetime to let a small moment like this get to her. Yet she couldn't help but feel an uncomfortable pull in the pit of her stomach. The two officers, a tall man and a shorter woman, exchanged glances before starting to walk toward her booth. Clara tried to remain calm, focusing on her book, but her eyes flicked up just in time to see them approaching. They reached her table, and the tall officer was the first to speak. His voice was stern, almost like a command. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked, his eyes scanning her face as though trying to read something. Clara paused for a moment, wondering what this was about. "Yes, I'm fine," Clara replied, her voice steady. She had been through enough in her life to handle a simple conversation with a police officer. She didn't feel the need to explain herself, especially in a place where she had come for some peace and quiet. But the officer didn't seem satisfied with her answer. He stood there for a moment just looking at her before he asked again, this time with more force. "What are you doing here, ma'am? You know, people don't usually sit alone at this hour." Clara furrowed her brow. The question caught her off guard. She was used to the occasional curious glance from strangers, but this felt different. She looked up at the officer, her calm expression unwavering, though she was beginning to feel uneasy. She was a regular here. This was her spot, and she had come many times before without any trouble. "I'm just having my coffee," Clara replied, her voice soft but firm, refusing to let the officer's questioning unsettle her. She wanted nothing more than to be left alone. The officer, however, was not satisfied. His eyes remained on her as though he was trying to decipher some hidden truth, something that didn't add up. Clara could see it in his eyes, a mixture of suspicion and something else, something that felt like judgment. The shorter officer, standing behind her partner, crossed her arms. Clara noticed that she didn't say anything at first, but her body language felt like she was silently assessing Clara. The longer they stood there, the more the tension in the room grew. It was as if the entire diner had gone silent, as though everyone else was waiting for what would happen next. Clara tried to ignore the feeling, but it was impossible. She felt the weight of their stares, the discomfort rising in her chest. Clara wasn't sure what had brought these officers to her table, but she didn't like it. They weren't asking the questions that one would expect in a friendly interaction. Instead, it felt more like an interrogation. She had seen enough of that in her time to recognize it when it happened. She had lived through the painful years of segregation, where people of color were constantly questioned, scrutinized, and made to feel small. It seemed that even though those days were long gone, some things hadn't changed. The officer's eyes narrowed slightly as he continued his questioning. "Where did you come from?" he asked, his tone slightly more accusatory. Clara's heart skipped again, but she didn't let her calm exterior falter. "I came from home," she answered simply, not wanting to engage any further. But the officer wasn't letting it go. His questions continued, each one more invasive than the last. Clara realized that this wasn't a simple matter of curiosity. It was something more. The officer seemed intent on digging deeper, trying to find something, anything, that would justify his questioning. Clara's mind raced as she sat there, weighing her options. She could feel the stares of the other customers in the diner, the eyes that had turned toward her, some of them uncomfortable, others perhaps sympathetic. But Clara refused to show any sign of weakness. She had seen enough injustice in her time to know that if she didn't stand her ground now, it could lead to something worse. She took a deep breath, her eyes steady on the officers. "I'm just a woman having breakfast," she said quietly but firmly. "I don't need to explain myself to you." There was a long pause as the officer seemed to weigh her response. Clara could feel the tension hanging in the air. The officer glanced at his partner and then back at Clara as though considering his next move. Clara wasn't sure how much longer they would stand there, asking questions that were neither helpful nor respectful. All she wanted was to finish her meal and go about her day in peace. As the officers stood there in silence, Clara's thoughts began to race. She knew what this was about. It wasn't about her having coffee. It was about the color of her skin. She had experienced it before, and now, in her later years, she still had to deal with it. The suspicion, the judgment, the subtle ways in which people like her were made to feel out of place, even in a place as ordinary as a diner. She didn't know how much longer this would last, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let these officers push her around. She wasn't going to let them make her feel small or insignificant. She had lived through too much to be intimidated now. Clara's grip tightened around her coffee cup, but her face remained calm, collected. This was not the first time she'd faced such treatment, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time, something was different. She wasn't alone anymore. The minutes felt like hours as Clara sat in her booth, the weight of the officer's questions hanging in the air. The soft hum of the diner seemed to have disappeared, replaced by an almost oppressive silence that enveloped the small space. The clatter of dishes and the murmur of voices from other patrons now felt distant, as if they were all holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Clara glanced around, noting how some of the regular customers seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what to do. She could see the waitress at the counter, trying to keep her focus on the coffee pot in front of her, but her eyes kept darting toward Clara and the officers. It was clear that the situation was making everyone uneasy. Clara, though, refused to let it affect her. She had been through too much in her life to let this moment break her. She was an 83-year-old woman who had witnessed the worst of human nature and the best of it, and this was just another test of her strength. The officer in front of her, the tall one with a sharp jawline, stood there for a moment, his eyes not leaving Clara's face. His partner, the shorter woman, had stepped back slightly, but she was still within earshot, watching the interaction unfold. The two officers exchanged a glance, as if silently communicating without saying a word. Clara could feel the judgment in the air, but she wasn't going to let them rattle her. "I told you I'm just here to have breakfast," Clara repeated, her voice steady but firm. "I've been coming here for years, and I've never had a problem before." The tall officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Clara could tell he was trying to figure out how to proceed, perhaps hoping she would say something that would give him the justification he was looking for. But Clara knew better. She knew that this wasn't about her behavior, it was about something much deeper. She had lived through the era of segregation, where she had been treated as less than human simply because of her race. Now, in her later years, she was still dealing with the lingering remnants of that prejudice. The officer looked down at his notebook, jotting something down, and then looked back at Clara. "We're just checking in on things. It's our job," he said, his tone slightly softer now, but there was still an underlying force behind his words. Clara's mind raced as she considered his statement. He was clearly trying to justify his actions, to make it seem like this was just part of his routine. But Clara wasn't fooled. This wasn't about doing their job. This was about making her feel like she didn't belong. She glanced out the window, seeing the morning sun shining brightly outside, unaware of the tension inside. It was a peaceful day, a day like any other. Yet here she was, caught in an interaction that felt like a throwback to an era she had hoped was behind her. She wasn't going to let them make her feel small. "I've been through a lot in my life," Clara said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of her years. "I've seen a lot of things, but I know when I'm being treated unfairly." The tall officer stiffened slightly at her words, clearly caught off guard by her calm response. Clara could see the flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Perhaps he hadn't expected her to speak so directly, so confidently. Clara had learned long ago that when facing injustice, the best way to respond was with dignity. She wasn't going to be intimidated into silence. She had earned the right to be heard. For a moment, neither officer said anything. The silence stretched between them like a heavy blanket. The other customers in the diner continued with their meals, but their glances kept flicking toward Clara. She could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't let it break her focus. She had learned to stand her ground, to refuse to be silent in the face of injustice. The taller officer cleared his throat, as if trying to regain control of the situation. "Ma'am," he said, his voice still formal but tinged with a hint of frustration. "We're not accusing you of anything, we just need to make sure everything's all right." Clara nodded slowly, but her eyes remained steady. "I'm fine," she replied. "I'm just having my breakfast, I don't need any help." She could see the officer's face begin to flush, the edges of his composure starting to fray. It was as if her calmness was throwing him off balance. He wasn't getting the response he expected. He had thought he could intimidate her, make her feel small or guilty for simply sitting in a diner. But Clara wasn't falling for it. She had lived through too many battles to be moved by someone like him. The shorter officer shifted her weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the situation was taking. She exchanged another glance with her partner, but this time there was something different in her eyes. Clara noticed it, a flicker of doubt, a recognition that maybe they were in the wrong, but it wasn't enough to stop them. They weren't backing down, at least not yet. They wanted something more from Clara. They wanted her to react, to show fear, to give them a reason to escalate the situation. But Clara wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. The longer this dragged on, the more Clara's thoughts began to race. She had dealt with harassment before in various forms, but this felt different. It wasn't just the officers' questions or their presence. It was the underlying assumption that she didn't belong, that she was out of place simply because of who she was. It wasn't the first time she had felt this way, but today it stung more than usual. She had been born in a time when racism was openly accepted. She had grown up in a world where she was treated as less than human, where her rights were denied simply because of the color of her skin. She had lived through the fight for equality, and while progress had been made, there were still days like this one, days when she was reminded that the fight was far from over. Clara took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't going to let them break her. She wasn't going to let them control her. She was a woman who had survived too much to be intimidated now. She was 83 years old, and she had lived through decades of struggle, triumph, and change. And she wasn't about to let some officer take away her peace on this quiet morning. The officer in front of her shifted again, his patience wearing thin. "We'll need to take down some information," he said, his voice no longer pretending to be kind or concerned. It was clear that he was trying to assert control over the situation. But Clara wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. She glanced at her phone, which sat quietly beside her coffee cup. It had been sitting there the whole time, but Clara had resisted the urge to use it, until now. Something told her that it was time to make a move. She wasn't going to let this continue, not when she knew she had the power to stop it. Clara slowly reached for her phone, her fingers steady as she dialed the number she knew by heart. It was a number she had called many times before, but today it felt different. She didn't need to say much when the person on the other end picked up. All she had to say was a few words, and they would know exactly what was happening. As the phone rang, Clara didn't take her eyes off the officers. She knew the game was about to change. The officers, for the first time, seemed uncertain. They didn't know what Clara was planning, but they would soon find out. Clara's fingers hovered over the phone for a moment, the weight of the decision settling over her. She wasn't afraid, but there was something stirring inside her, something that told her she was about to take a step that would change everything. The officers were still standing in front of her, their eyes locked on her as if they were waiting for her to make the next move. Clara knew that whatever happened next, she had to be prepared. She had faced so much in her life, but this moment felt like a crossroads. It was a quiet fight, but it was one that could make a difference, even if just for her. The phone finally clicked. and she heard the familiar voice on the other end. It was Thomas, her nephew, a civil rights lawyer who had always been there for her, even when she didn't ask for help. He was one of the few people who truly understood what she had gone through in her lifetime, the struggles, the triumphs, and the subtle, everyday injustices that were still so prevalent. Clara didn't need to say much. With just a few words, Thomas would know exactly what was happening. "Thomas," Clara said, her voice calm but firm, "they're here, I need you." She didn't need to explain further. Her nephew knew that when Clara called, it was time to act. She could hear the shift in his tone as he responded, his voice urgent but controlled. "I'm on my way, Aunt Clara. Stay calm. Don't let them push you." Clara didn't respond. She didn't need to. She knew Thomas would handle it just as he always did. He had been there for her when the world was too much, and now she was calling on him again. He had a way of making everything feel right, of bringing justice where it was so often missing. As Clara ended the call, she could feel a small sense of relief wash over her. She had done what she needed to do, but the officers didn't know yet. They still thought they were in control, but Clara wasn't going to let them stay in that illusion for long. The tall officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a sign that he was growing impatient. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a little more forceful now, "we're going to need some cooperation here. We don't have all day." Clara kept her eyes steady on him. She had dealt with far worse than this in her life. The officers, however, didn't know the full story of Clara Williams. They didn't know the woman who had stood strong through decades of adversity. They didn't know the quiet strength that ran through her veins, a strength that had been forged by years of struggle and resilience. She wasn't about to let them reduce her to someone who could be intimidated by their uniforms and authority. "I'm cooperating," Clara said, her voice measured, though her patience was clearly wearing thin. "But I won't tolerate being treated like I don't belong here. I've been coming to this diner for years. I'm just here to have my breakfast, and that's all you need to know." The officer opened his mouth as if to respond, but Clara didn't give him the chance. She had made herself clear. Her words were simple, but they carried weight. She wasn't backing down, and with each passing moment, Clara could feel the situation slipping out of the officer's control. They hadn't expected her to stand so firm, and now they were unsure how to proceed. The shorter officer took a step forward, her arms crossed in front of her. "Ma'am, we're just doing our job. We're not here to cause trouble. But we need to know who you are, and we need to make sure everything's in order." There was a hint of uncertainty in her voice, a subtle crack in her otherwise confident demeanor. Clara didn't flinch. She wasn't going to give them anything they weren't entitled to. She had nothing to prove to them. She was a citizen, and she had every right to sit in that diner, to enjoy her meal, and to live her life without fear or harassment. She had already been through too much to let this moment rattle her. She had lived through a time when people like her weren't allowed to sit at a lunch counter, when she wasn't allowed to vote or have her voice heard. But now, things were different. She wasn't going to let these officers rewrite her story. The silence between them stretched on, uncomfortable and thick. Clara could hear the sounds of the diner in the background, the clink of silverware, the murmur of conversation, the soft hiss of the coffee machine. But it all seemed distant now, as if they were in a bubble of tension. The officers were standing in front of her, unsure of how to proceed. They were trying to assert their authority, but Clara wasn't having it. She wasn't going to let them control this moment. As Clara sat there, still and unyielding, the door to the diner swung open, and Thomas walked in. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Clara. The officers didn't notice him at first, too focused on the woman sitting before them. But Clara saw the change in the atmosphere as soon as Thomas entered. He had a presence, a calm authority that came from years of fighting for justice. He was here now, and the officers could feel the shift. Thomas didn't speak immediately. Instead, he walked toward Clara's booth, his gaze never leaving the officers. There was a brief moment of silence as the officers turned their attention toward him. He was tall, his posture straight, and his expression was calm but resolute. He didn't need to say anything yet. His presence alone spoke volumes. The taller officer finally broke the silence, his voice uncertain. "Can we help you, sir?" Thomas glanced at Clara, who gave him a small nod, signaling that everything was under control. He turned back to the officer and spoke, his voice firm but measured. "I'm Thomas Williams, and I'm here to make sure my aunt is treated with the respect she deserves. She doesn't need to be harassed in a place like this." The officer's eyes widened slightly at his response. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected someone to stand up to them to challenge their authority. But Thomas wasn't intimidated. He had been trained to deal with situations like this, to stand up for what was right. And now he was ready to take action. "I suggest you step away from my aunt," Thomas continued, his voice unwavering. "You don't have any right to question her, and I'll make sure you know that if necessary." The shorter officer glanced at her partner, and for the first time, Clara saw hesitation in their eyes. They hadn't expected the situation to escalate like this. They had assumed that Clara would back down, that she would cower in fear, but they were wrong. She hadn't given them that satisfaction, and now, with Thomas by her side, she wasn't going to. Clara sat back in her booth, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She wasn't afraid anymore. The officers, though still standing, seemed to lose their confidence. They knew that Thomas had the power to make this situation go away, and that made them uneasy. The situation had flipped in an instant, and Clara felt a surge of empowerment. She wasn't going to let them take her dignity away. She wasn't going to let them make her feel small. As Thomas stood beside her, ready to back her up, Clara knew that she had made the right call. She had stood her ground, and now, with the support of her nephew, the officers were the ones who felt unsure. She had turned the tide, and in that moment, Clara Williams knew that she wasn't alone. She had never been alone in her fight for justice. The tall officer, now clearly rattled by Thomas's presence, shifted his stance. It was clear that he hadn't expected the situation to unfold this way. In the face of Thomas's quiet authority, the confidence that had once filled the room seemed to drain from the officers. The air, thick with tension just moments ago, now felt strangely still, like the calm before a storm. The officer cleared his throat, trying to regain some composure. His partner, the shorter officer, stood by silently, her arms still crossed, but her posture was now less certain. Thomas had a way of standing, a way of carrying himself that commanded respect without needing to raise his voice. He wasn't here to cause trouble. He was here to make sure his aunt, Clara, was treated with dignity, something that had been sorely lacking just moments ago. Clara watched her nephew carefully, his calm demeanor steadying her nerves. She had always admired Thomas for his ability to remain unshaken in the face of adversity. She could see that now, as he stood beside her, his eyes locked on the officers, as though daring them to challenge his authority. The tall officer hesitated for a moment, his hand still gripping his notepad as if it were a lifeline. "We didn't mean to cause any trouble," he said, the words coming out softer than before. "We're just doing our job." But his words sounded hollow now. Clara had heard the same thing countless times throughout her life. Police officers hiding behind the excuse of doing their job when their actions were anything but fair. She knew it wasn't about procedure or concern. It was about something deeper, something that ran through the core of society like a hidden current. Thomas didn't flinch at the officer's attempt to defuse the situation. "It's not about your job," he said, his voice firm but calm. "It's about respect. My aunt has lived a long life, and she's earned the right to sit wherever she pleases without being questioned or harassed. So unless you have a valid reason for being here, I suggest you leave her alone." The tall officer, clearly unnerved, glanced at his partner for support. But the shorter officer remained silent, her arms still crossed, her expression unreadable. It seemed like she was weighing the situation, unsure of what to do next. The balance had shifted. The power dynamic that once favored the officers had crumbled, replaced by something that neither of them were prepared for. Clara's unshakable resolve, paired with Thomas's unwavering support. Clara's hand rested on the edge of her coffee cup, her fingers curling around it slightly. She felt a wave of quiet satisfaction as the officers struggled to find their footing. She had not given them the satisfaction of fear or submission, and now they were the ones caught in uncertainty. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and for the first time in a long time, Clara felt like she could breathe freely again. The tension in the air wasn't just from the officers anymore. It was from their own discomfort, their realization that they had crossed a line and didn't have the justification to keep going. Thomas stepped forward slightly, his presence filling the space between them. He was still calm, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes. "You're not here to serve and protect if you're treating people like this," he said, his words deliberate. "You're here to intimidate, and that's not okay." The last sentence hung in the air, sharp and clear. The officers exchanged another glance. The tall officer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. It was as if the moment had stolen his voice. The power had shifted entirely to Thomas and Clara. They were no longer the ones who were being scrutinized. It was the officers now, trapped by their own actions. They had been caught in a situation that they couldn't control, and it was clear that they didn't have the proper answers. Clara remained silent, but her heart swelled with pride as she watched Thomas. She had known that he would handle the situation with the kind of dignity and strength that came from years of fighting for what was right. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever faced unfair treatment. Thomas wasn't just defending Clara, he was standing up for anyone who had ever been silenced or ignored. The shorter officer finally spoke, her voice hesitant, but her words were not the same as before. "We're sorry, ma'am," she said to Clara. "We didn't mean to upset you." It wasn't an apology, it wasn't an admission of guilt, but it was a shift, a sign that perhaps they were beginning to understand just how wrong they had been. Clara didn't respond immediately. She looked at the officer, her eyes steady and unyielding. She had learned long ago that some apologies weren't worth accepting, especially when they were offered without true understanding. This wasn't about saying sorry. This was about ensuring that this never happened again, not just to her, but to anyone else who walked into that diner or any other place. The tall officer took a step back, his face flushed with embarrassment. He had lost control of the situation, and he knew it. There was nothing more to say. Clara could see it in his eyes. They had hoped to intimidate her, to make her feel small. But she had turned the tables on them with nothing more than her calm demeanor and the support of her nephew. It wasn't about raising a fist or shouting. It was about standing firm in the face of injustice and not allowing it to continue. As the officers turned to leave, the diner seemed to return to normal, though the energy had shifted. The murmur of conversation resumed, and the clink of silverware filled the air again. But Clara knew that something had changed, not just in the diner, but in herself as well. She had stood her ground, and it had made all the difference. She wasn't just a passive observer in her own life anymore. She was an active participant in her own story, and today she had written a chapter that she could be proud of. The officers exited the diner, their heads down, their posture defeated. Clara watched them go, not with a sense of victory, but with a quiet sense of justice. She knew that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for what was right, even when it seemed like the odds were against you. And in that moment, Clara Williams had shown that even in the smallest moments, one voice could make a difference. As the officers walked out of the diner, Clara felt a sense of calm settle over her. The tension that had gripped the small establishment for what seemed like hours was finally starting to dissipate. The soft murmur of voices and the clinking of silverware returned, but Clara's mind was still racing, her heart pounding from the intensity of the moment. She glanced at Thomas, who was standing beside her, his expression calm and composed. She could tell he wasn't celebrating the moment, but rather processing it in his own way. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Clara simply took a deep breath, her gaze focused on the door through which the officers had just exited. She could still feel the presence of the two officers in the air, even though they were no longer there. It was a strange feeling, almost as though the world had shifted ever so slightly, leaving a quiet echo of their departure behind. The waitress, who had been watching from the counter the whole time, finally spoke up. "Are you okay, ma'am?" Her voice was tentative, unsure of how to navigate the situation that had just unfolded. Clara turned to her with a gentle smile, her shoulders relaxing. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, her voice steady once more. She didn't need to explain herself any further. She had stood up for herself, and now the weight of the world seemed to have lifted off her shoulders. Thomas took a seat across from Clara in the booth, his eyes still scanning the room, though the threat had long passed. "You handled that well, Aunt Clara," he said quietly, his voice warm with pride. Clara gave him a small nod, but her mind wasn't fully present in the diner anymore. It was lost in thought, reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had always known how to survive, how to adapt, but moments like this reminded her that survival was more than just getting through the day. It was about reclaiming dignity, about standing firm against things that tried to take it from you. "I didn't do much," Clara said softly, glancing at her nephew. "I just stood there and refused to back down, but you took control, you made them see that they couldn't just walk all over me." Thomas shook his head slightly, leaning back in the booth. "You've taught me everything I know about standing up for what's right," he replied. "This wasn't just me, it was both of us. You showed them that they can't get away with things like this anymore." Clara felt a surge of emotion, but she pushed it down, keeping her face neutral. It wasn't about feeling sorry for herself or reveling in victory. It was about knowing that, in that moment, justice had prevailed. They hadn't backed down. They hadn't let intimidation take control of the situation. Clara had always believed that the little things mattered, the small acts of defiance, the quiet moments of standing firm. And this was one of those moments. As Clara sat there, reflecting on everything that had happened, the other patrons in the diner seemed to relax. The tension that had lingered over them, making everything feel a little off, slowly started to fade. People went back to eating their meals, chatting with friends, and going about their day. But there was something different now. It was like the air had been cleared, the weight lifted from the room, and the space felt a little safer. Clara noticed a few quiet nods and smiles from some of the regulars, silent acknowledgments of what had just transpired, of the power of standing up for yourself, no matter your age or your race. The waitress returned with a fresh pot of coffee, placing it in front of Clara with a small, polite smile. "Can I get you anything else, ma'am?" she asked, her voice more respectful now, more genuine. Clara smiled back, grateful for the kindness. "No, just the coffee is fine, thank you," she replied, her tone warm but calm. It was clear to Clara that the atmosphere had changed, but she didn't need to speak about it. Everyone could feel it. The respect in the air, the quiet understanding that sometimes things needed to be called out and dealt with. The diner, which had once been filled with uncertainty and discomfort, had transformed into a place of quiet solidarity. It wasn't just about Clara's victory. It was about everyone who had witnessed the moment. Everyone who had watched Clara refuse to be cowed, who had seen Thomas step in and back her up, and who now understood, in some small way, that things like this couldn't be ignored. They couldn't just slip away unnoticed. The injustice had been visible, and it had been dealt with not through violence or shouting, but through the simple act of standing firm. Clara sipped her coffee, letting the warmth spread through her. She felt lighter now, the burden of the earlier confrontation slowly ebbing away. Her mind shifted to the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one moment in a diner. This was about every person who had ever been made to feel small, who had been intimidated into silence, who had been made to feel that their voice didn't matter. Clara knew there were many more battles to be fought, but today she had fought one, and she had won. Not through force or anger, but through quiet strength and the willingness to stand her ground. She looked across the table at Thomas, who was now looking out the window, his expression thoughtful. "I'm proud of you, Thomas," Clara said quietly, her voice full of emotion. "You've become someone I can count on, someone who knows how to fight for what's right, and I'm grateful for that." Thomas turned back to her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I learned from the best," he said simply, his tone full of affection and respect. Clara nodded, taking another sip of coffee. She didn't need more words. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared understanding that they had made a difference today, and that sometimes the smallest acts of courage could ripple outward, affecting more than just the people involved. The diner began to return to its normal rhythm, but for Clara, this moment would stay with her. It was a reminder of her own strength, of the power that came from not letting the world make her feel small. It was a reminder that, no matter how old she got, she still had the ability to stand up for herself, to fight for what was right, and to make sure that the next generation didn't forget what it meant to stand tall. As they finished their meal, Clara felt a sense of peace settle over her. The battle had been won not just for her, but for anyone who had ever felt the sting of unfair treatment. She had fought the good fight, and today, justice had been served. It was a victory that would stay with her, a victory that she would carry with her, as she had carried every other fight she had faced in her long and meaningful life. Clara and Thomas finished their meal in silence, the calm that had followed the earlier tension settling over them like a soft blanket. Clara looked around the diner one last time, noticing the way the morning light filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over the worn wooden tables. It was peaceful now. The unease that had gripped the place just moments before had dissolved, replaced by a quiet sense of normalcy. Clara took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past few hours lift off her shoulders. The ordeal had come to an end, but the memory of what had just happened would stay with her for much longer. As they finished their coffee, Clara noticed how the regulars in the diner seemed to move about more freely now. Their glances were no longer furtive. The looks they exchanged were more knowing, a silent acknowledgement of what had taken place. Clara had always known that these small moments, when people stand up for what's right, ripple out and affect more than just the individuals involved. Today, she had been that person who had stood firm, and her actions had made an impact on everyone who had witnessed it. She could feel it in the air, a subtle change in the energy of the room. Thomas sat back in the booth, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of his coffee cup as he looked out the window. He had said very little since the officers left, but Clara knew he was processing everything in his own way. He was proud of what had happened, of how she had handled herself, but there was something more in his silence. It was the reflection of someone who understood just how much these small victories meant, especially when they came in the form of standing up to systemic injustice. Thomas had been raised with a strong sense of right and wrong, a sense that had been passed down to him from Clara and others who had fought so many battles before him. Clara watched him, a soft smile on her lips. She had always known that Thomas would grow into someone who would make a difference. He was smart, compassionate, and fiercely determined. Today, he had not only defended her, but he had also shown everyone in that diner the power of standing up for what was right, no matter how uncomfortable the situation might seem. Clara had done her part, but it had been Thomas's quiet confidence and his calm, assured presence that had turned the tide. She was proud of him, but more than that, she was grateful. After a few moments, Thomas turned to her, his eyes thoughtful. "I didn't think it would go down like that," he said, his voice low, as though he were still processing the unexpected turn of events. "I thought maybe they'd just ask a few questions and leave, but when you stood up to them, when you refused to be intimidated, it was like they didn't know what to do. I've never seen anything like it." Clara chuckled softly, the sound warm and comforting. "You did more than just stand by, Thomas. You made sure that things didn't go too far. You helped turn the situation around. You helped me." Thomas shook his head, his expression serious but kind. "I didn't do anything that wasn't right. I just made sure they knew they couldn't get away with what they were doing. But you, Aunt Clara, you've been fighting your whole life. I'm just following in your footsteps." Clara smiled, a deep, knowing smile that spoke volumes. She had always believed in the power of small acts of courage, the quiet resistance that made a difference without fanfare or recognition. And now, Thomas was continuing that legacy. He had fought his own battles, and he had helped her fight this one. For Clara, it was a reminder that the work of those who came before was never in vain. The generations that followed had the power to continue the fight, to carry the torch of justice forward, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. As they got up from the booth and made their way to the door, Clara felt a sense of peace settle within her. The day had unfolded in a way that she hadn't expected, but it had reinforced something she had known all along, that standing up for what's right, even in the smallest ways, was never a wasted effort. She had been harassed, but she had not let it define her. She had taken control of the situation, and in doing so, she had shown everyone around her the importance of standing firm against injustice. It wasn't just about that moment. It was about the ripple effect of standing up for yourself, for what was right. The sun outside was shining brightly now, the day clear and open, and Clara felt a renewed sense of strength. She had spent so many years fighting for herself and for others, and today had been another chapter in that long story. But it was more than just a personal victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever faced intimidation, for anyone who had ever felt small because of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their life. It was a reminder that, no matter how many years had passed, the fight for equality and dignity was still ongoing, and that it was a fight worth having. As Clara and Thomas stepped outside into the warm sunlight, Clara felt a sense of gratitude wash over her. Not just for the moment she had just experienced, but for the years of life that had brought her to this point. She had seen so much, both good and bad, but it was moments like this one, when she had stood firm, when she had not let the world push her around, that reminded her of the power of resilience. She had survived the worst, and she was still here, stronger than ever. "I'm proud of you, Aunt Clara," Thomas said again, his voice sincere. "Today you taught me something important. It's not just about what happens in the moment. It's about how you carry yourself, how you face things. You don't let the world define you. You define yourself. Clara nodded, her heart full. We all have to define ourselves, Thomas. We can't let anyone else tell us who we are or what we can or can't do. We fight for what's right, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Thomas smiled, a hint of awe in his expression. I know you've been through so much, Aunt Clara, but you've always taught me to never back down. Today, you showed me why. Clara placed a hand gently on his arm, giving it a small squeeze. And I'll keep teaching you, Thomas. We may not have all the answers, but as long as we keep fighting, we're doing something right. As they walked down the sidewalk together, side by side, Clara knew that this moment, this quiet victory, was just one of many in her life. It wasn't just about the diner or the officers. It was about a lifetime of standing up for what was right, of teaching the next generation to do the same, and of showing that dignity and respect could never be taken away, not as long as you were willing to fight for it. And in that moment, Clara Williams knew that, no matter how much time passed, she would continue to stand tall, a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of fighting for justice, one small act at a time.